Welcome everyone to the video. Welcome to the channel. In this video, this is really gonna take off in a little bit of a different direction. Well, pretty significant different direction. I tend to tie a lot of things in about identity and current events. Things I see in the news that are right in the news right now. This is gonna really take an off ramp right off that freeway for a little bit. Still going over identity and things like that, but stay with me here. If you like the video, if you like the content, please consider subscribing, hitting the thumbs up to like it. But let's get into the video because I'm titling this one. What am I titling this one? The dangerous lie we've been told about love. And there's an idea out there that most of us have heard our entire lives. The idea is repeated in movies and television and books and songs. That's really how I got the idea for this video here. An idea, that's very, very common that we really don't stop and question at all. And that idea that somewhere out there, there's another person who will complete us, someone who will make us whole, someone who will finally give our life meaning, someone who will fix what feels broken inside or feel like, what we're missing. And when we hear those stories, they all seem, great stories, beautiful stories, romantic, hopeful, human. But I'm going to be asking the question, a very difficult question is, what if we've misunderstood love this entire time? What if one of the most popular messages in modern culture is actually creating very unhealthy relationships? And what if the goal of love was never to find someone to complete you? What if the goal was to become complete enough that you can genuinely share your life with another person? Because the truth is, many people aren't entering relationships from a place of strength in their life. They're entering relationships from a place of searching. Searching for what? We've talked about this a lot. Searching for identity, searching for a purpose, or it could be validation, or simply just to belong. They're really on a search for themselves. And then when we ask another person to provide all those things, we place a weight on the relationship, that really no relationship was ever, I believe, was designed to carry. And, I want to talk about identity, love, dependence, and one of the most dangerous lies we've ever been told about relationships. Not because, again, not because love is bad, but because love deserves much better than, what we have turned it into. So if you first think about how often, you've heard the phrase, you complete me, most people immediately recognize it. It becomes one of the defining ideas of romance or, marriage or, eventually marriage, um, to incomplete people finding each other, two halves becoming whole. What's that little, the old, what do they call it? The necklace with the two halves of the heart, a missing puzzle piece, finally coming together as one. Such a common story that we rarely stop to ask whether that's even healthy. Imagine for a moment that you know, someone who truly believes they're incomplete, that they are missing something essential, that they cannot be happy alone, that they cannot be fulfilled alone, and that they cannot find purpose on their own. Now imagine that person enters a relationship. The relationship doesn't simply, become important. It becomes a necessity. And that's where the problems begin. Because if another person becomes responsible for your happiness, what happens when they end up disappointing you? It's going to happen in no matter what relationship. Trust me. If another person becomes responsible for your self worth, what happens when they criticize you? If another person becomes responsible for your identity, what happens if things don't work out and they ultimately leave? The relationship becomes fragile because it is carrying far more weight than it was ever designed to hold. Love becomes less about sharing life and more about survival. One question I think modern society struggles with the most is, incredibly simple. Just who are you? It's not your job. And no matter how much we describe ourselves, I talked about that in a previous video. I've talked to death about politics. We'll talk about more about politics in the future. It's not, who you are on social media, your relationship status. That's a big deal back in the day in social media is what your relationship status was. Um, who are you when all those labels disappear? Many people never spend enough time asking the question, we move from school to work, from one distraction to another, from one stage of our life to the next. You're constantly moving, constantly consuming, constantly evolving. We're constantly distracted as well too. I've talked about that before. And because we never develop a strong sense of self, relationships often become a shortcut. Instead of discovering who we are, we merge ourselves into another person. We adopt their interests, maybe their habits and or their opinions. Maybe we, come up with our own combined goals, or we simply adopt their goals. We become their identity. Uh, how many couples introduce themselves as we? It's one or the other. At first, it feels just natural, even romantic. But over time, something strange happens. We start losing ourselves. It's not intentionally, it's not malicious. It's just a gradually quiet, one piece by one piece until one day we look in the mirror and realize we're no longer sure really who we are. I want you to think about, music for a moment. Love songs. How many are there? Probably countless. Um, if you listen closely, you'll notice a pattern. I was lost until I found you. I was nothing before you. You're my very reason for living. You saved me. How many times have you heard "You're my everything"? Um, I like those songs. I listen to them a lot. I'm a big country music fan, and there's a lot of love songs in country music, a lot of heartache in country music. I understand what these songs are trying to express, but imagine hearing those messages, thousands of times throughout your life. What starts out as poetry slowly becomes the expectation. We begin believing that true love should feel like a rescue situation, like another person should be saving us, like another person should heal our wounds, that another person should fill every empty space. And when reality doesn't match that fantasy, disappointment sets in. And not because, the relationship is unhealthy, but because the expectation was already impossible to meet. No human being can carry that burden forever. Eventually, reality just comes knocking and, it's not going to go away. And reality is never as perfect as a fantasy. Um, Something really fascinating happens when people enter relationships. Sometimes the relationship becomes their entire identity. Every decision revolves around it. What's the latest movie? We just watched the latest movie, Obsession. Um, every conversation revolves around it. Every goal revolves around it. Um, and before long, the individual disappears. Only the relationship remains. Now, there's nothing wrong with commitment. There's nothing wrong with partnership. There's nothing wrong with wanting to build a life together. The problem occurs when the relationship replaces the individual. Healthy relationships require two people, not a singular identity. Two people with two minds, two perspectives, two lives choosing to move together. If one person completely disappears inside the relationship, eventually resentment will often follow because sacrificing your identity isn't the same thing as sharing your life with each other. And many people aren't afraid of losing a relationship. They're afraid of simply being alone. That there's a difference between the two. Being alone forces us to sit with ourselves. I did a whole video on this. you know, being by yourself with no distractions, nobody there to validate you, or give you constant reassurance. And for many people, that feels incredibly terrifying because being alone often exposes questions that we are always avoiding. Like, who am I? What do I want? And what do I believe? Am I even happy here by myself? And am I fulfilled? Do I even like myself? Relationships can sometimes become a way to avoid all those questions. It's not intentionally or consciously done. Um, as long as another person is present, we really never have to face ourselves. And that can become incredibly dangerous because eventually every person must eventually answer those questions. Whether they're single and or married, young or old, whether you are successful already or you're struggling to try to achieve some sort of success. The conversation with yourself, you know, it can only be postponed for so long, but you'll have to face it eventually. One thing I find interesting is how often solitude appears, throughout many spiritual traditions. Not loneliness. It's not loneliness. It's solitude. I always look back to Christianity when, Jesus spent those 40 days and 40 nights in the desert in solitude. There's a difference. Many important figures spend time alone, reflecting, learning, growing, discovering who they were. The lesson was never that people should isolate themselves forever. The lesson was that identity should not depend entirely upon other people. Because if you don't know who you are alone, you'll struggle to know who you are together. The strongest relationships out there aren't built by people desperately trying to escape themselves. They're built by people who already understand themselves. Um, I think modern technology just really has amplified this problem. Today, we're constantly connected through text messages, social media, entertainment. The silence has completely disappeared. The solitude has disappeared. And with it, many opportunities for self reflection. In previous generations, people often had long periods of boredom. I've talked about this before as well. Long periods of quiet, just simply, just having time to just sit there and think, wonder and wonder. You just let your mind go. Time to wrestle with life's bigger questions. Today, pick up our phones whenever there's a silent moment, you know? And because we avoid silence, we often avoid ourselves. And we enter relationships still carrying all those unanswered questions, carrying uncertainty, confusion, and we expect another person to solve, the problems that we have yet to confront ourselves. This may be the most important distinction in today's discussion is love and dependence are not the same thing. Love says you choose. Dependence is I need you. Love says, my life is better with you. Dependence says, my life cannot function without you. Love allows for freedom. Dependence creates fear, fear of loss. Creation creates a partnership where dependence creates pressure. The two can look very similar from the outside, but internally they will feel very, very different. One is built on choice, the other is built simply out of necessity. And healthy relationships require choice every day, again and again. You know, um, if your relationship ended tomorrow, would you still know who you are? Not whether you'd be hurt, because of course, we would, we're human, right? Um, it's not whether you'd grieve. Of course you would. The question goes far deeper. Would your identity survive? Would your values survive? Would you still have purpose? Would your sense of, self survival still be there? Would you feel like you disappeared along with the relationship? The answer to that question, will really reveal a lot about you. Maybe the goal isn't, finding someone to complete you. Maybe the goal is becoming complete enough to generally share your life. Imagine two people knowing exactly who they are, both understanding their values, both have a purpose, both know their identity, both can stand on their own 2 feet. Now imagine those two people choosing each other, not because one or the other needs saving, not because validation is needed or someone needs to be rescued, but because they want to build something together. Now that feels a lot different. It's healthier. It's strong and far more sustainable because neither person is carrying the other's entire existence. They're sharing the journey together, not becoming responsible for each other's identity. Maybe one of the greatest misunderstandings about love is that, the belief the other person is supposed to tell us who we are, that they're supposed to complete us, somehow fix us or save us from something. But perhaps real love begins somewhere else. Perhaps it begins when we finally understand ourselves, when we stop searching for someone else to provide our identity, when we stop expecting another human being to carry the weight of a journey that we have left unfinished. Because relationships are powerful, but they're not substitutes for self-discovery. And, maybe that's the lesson that the healthiest relationships aren't built by two people desperately searching for themselves. They're built by two people who have already begun that journey. People who know who they are. They know what they value. They know what they believe in. People who can stand on their own and still choose to stand together because love shouldn't add to your identity, not become your identity. And maybe that's the dangerous lie that we've been told all along, that another person was supposed to make us whole, when perhaps the real challenge was learning how to become whole, ourselves. And I think that's where I'll leave it today. Thanks for listening. I hope this helps people out there. Again, I was listening to a song. I'm a huge country music fan. I grew up listening to country. I like all kinds of music. I like everything from rock to rap, hip hop, country. But I grew up listening to country music, and there's obviously a lot of love songs in country music, and a lot of heartache in country music, and that's really what was the inspiration for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.